Greetings, class. This is lecture number 8 on the book of Habakkuk. Trust that you all had a good week away from too much schoolwork. I know you studied hard for your midterm, but now time to get going on the home stretch, and so we'll begin with the book of Habakkuk. You may have begun to see a pattern emerging in the minor prophets, and Habakkuk certainly continues the tradition in that we know practically nothing of the prophets themselves outside of the book which they're credited with writing. We do know that Habakkuk's name comes from the Hebrew word Habak, which means to embrace. And so we really can see, in keeping with his name, we see how Habakkuk earnestly embraced God in prayer for the nation and embraced him in praise for his greatness, particularly in resolving the prophet's dilemma concerning holiness. And we'll talk a little bit more about Hosea's dilemma with the holiness of God later on. Habakkuk is never mentioned anywhere else in Scripture. The only mentions that we have of his name are, in fact, the inscriptions in the book in 1:1 and then again in 3:1. Some think that Habakkuk might have been a Levite because of the liturgical nature of the psalm that we have in chapter 3, and we're going to discuss chapter 3 a little bit later in greater detail because I think there's a lot that we can unpack from chapter 3. But a lot of people see it as a psalm, and we call it the Psalm of Habakkuk. And so a lot of people view Habakkuk as a Levite because of the liturgical nature of the psalm. But one of the things we know about the foremost psalmist in the Hebrew Bible, David, is that he certainly was not a Levite. And so it's not necessary really for us to assume Habakkuk was of a Levitical lineage based on the inclusion of the psalm in chapter 3. Again, as with many of the books of the minor prophets, we're only given faint clues as to the dating of the book within the book. However, like some of the others, like Hosea and Amos, those clues really kind of help us to form a general consensus of the date and in which Habakkuk was written. We know pretty close to dates for Hosea and Amos, and likewise we have a pretty good idea about a date roughly 607 BC for the prophet Habakkuk for the writing of this book based on the clues in the text. The mention of the Chaldean threat in 1:6, or the Babylonian threat, suggests that the book should be dated prior to the initial assault of Babylon in roughly 605 BC. Likewise, the lack of any mention of Nineveh or the Assyrians suggests that we should date the book sometime after the fall of Nineveh in 612. So this narrows our window down to roughly 7 to 8 years. 612 to 605 BC is a pretty tight window that we have already. But when we look, we can narrow this down even further by looking at Habakkuk's concern over the violence in Judah. We have King Josiah, who was really the great reformationist of his day, and I think it's fitting that we should talk about Josiah's reformation during the same week that we celebrate the beginning of Martin Luther's Reformation, the nailing of the 95 Theses that issued in the Protestant Reformation. And if you know your Israelite history, then you know that it's during the reign of Josiah that the book of the law is discovered. About 621 BC is typically the date that we assign to this. And so this kind of issues in this return of to Israel's covenant relationship with God, this reform, if you will, revival, you might even call it. And then Josiah dies in about 609, and he's succeeded by Jehoiakim. And by contrast, Jehoiakim is a wicked king. And many of the reforms that had taken place during Josiah's reign quickly are forgotten during the reign of Jehoiakim. So we can assume, based on Habakkuk's concern over violence in Judah, that we ought to date this to sometime after Josiah's death and Jehoiakim's ascension to the throne in 609 BC. So if we give it a couple of years for Josiah's reforms to have been undone, we can pretty safely assume a date of roughly 607 BC, which is prior to the subjugation at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuchadnezzar subjugates Jehoiakim and kind of makes him his vassal, if you will. So we can pretty much say about 607 is a pretty good date for Habakkuk, and actually it gives us some confidence because we don't have a lot of books in the Old Testament period, much less in the minor prophets, that we can date so narrowly. From a geopolitical standpoint, at this time, we really see the power struggle going on in the ancient Near East. We've got Assyria and Egypt and Babylon. And then the struggle really turns heavily in Babylon's favor in the late 7th century. Nineveh, which is the Assyrian capital, falls in 612. And then in 605, we've got the Egyptian army that's routed at Carchemish. And so Babylon really becomes established as the superpower in the ancient Near East at this time. And the reforms that had taken place under Josiah, coincidentally reforms that may well have spared Judah from an earlier captivity, they're quickly forgotten, and Jehoiakim's corrupt policies really kind of mirror those policies of King Manasseh. And Manasseh is often referred to as the most wicked king to have ever sat upon the throne of Judah. And so it's something else to make this comparison between Jehoiakim and Manasseh, but it really gives you some idea of how quickly things went downhill after Josiah had implemented these reforms, and there's this covenant renewal in Judah. And then just so quickly after his death, things begin to just take a turn for the worst. And 605, we've got the first invasion of the Babylonians into Judah. And then 20 years later, we've got Jerusalem falling and the temple being destroyed. Judah is in captivity. So just a really quick turn. And Habakkuk comes along at this time, and he's a prophet, a contemporary of the prophet Jeremiah. And both he and Jeremiah are delivering their prophetic utterances to a nation that is essentially ripe for inevitable judgment. Judgment is coming. There's no getting around it, no escaping it. Judah has clearly not learned their lesson. In spite of God's judgment of Samaria, in spite of God's judgment of Nineveh or Noaman in Egypt, Thebes in Egypt, Jerusalem, Judah has not learned her lesson. And so now Jerusalem is going to suffer a similar fate as these other capital cities at the hands of yet another vicious adversary who has been divinely appointed. And so when we look at the purpose of the book of Habakkuk, we see that Habakkuk is really emphasizing God's holiness in judging Judah for her sins. Even though he's using an even more wicked nation to accomplish this judgment, the emphasis is on God's holiness, because that wicked nation would eventually be destroyed. They would eventually suffer the consequences of their own idolatry and their own wickedness. And we see Habakkuk really struggling with this concept of holiness, primarily because God is using nations that aren't holy to judge Judah, and he's used a nation that wasn't holy to judge Assyria. And so Habakkuk has some struggles, and we'll talk about those in just a few minutes as well. When we look at the theme of the book of Habakkuk, not just the purpose, but the overall theme, The New Schofield Bible gives the theme as being from doubt to faith, which really signifies the change that Habakkuk and God, through Habakkuk, desired to see in the hearts and minds of the people of Judah. And so you want to remember, this was made pretty clear in the printed out notes, but you want to remember for quiz or exam that the New Schofield Bible gives the theme as being from doubt to faith. Make sure you keep that in mind. However, I think a more appropriate theme may well be what we read in the second part of Habakkuk 2:4, when it says, "The just or the righteous shall live by faith." Interestingly enough, if we adhere to the view of a lot of critical scholars that chapter 3 is a later addition to Habakkuk and not part of the original, then Habakkuk 2:4 really stands in the very center of Habakkuk's message. Now, I'm not going to argue for chapter 3 being a later addition, but that's certainly something that's out there, and we'll talk about that later on. There are a number of unique features about Habakkuk's message, and so I want to just take a few minutes to look at some of these. And I want to go ahead and apologize if I say Hosea. We're talking about Habakkuk, but those H names, man, sometimes I just want to say Hosea, and it's Habakkuk. Habakkuk is what we're talking about, so forgive me if I say Hosea. But one of the first things that we notice about Habakkuk is that it stands out among the prophetic literature because it contains so little prophecy by comparison. Remember when we discussed Jonah, that one of the unique features of that book is that it contains so much narrative and so little in the way of poetic prophetic oracles. Unlike Jonah, however, Habakkuk really maintains the flow of Hebrew poetry and Hebrew poetics that we see in the rest of the minor prophets. But instead of prophetic oracles, much of what Habakkuk gives us is more prayer than prophecy. It's more of a prayer than it is a prophetic utterance. And in that regard, Habakkuk is really quite daring in his dialogue with God, because he continuously confronts God with questions that really seem to challenge him on his holiness and his love. And this prayer really continues throughout the book as the prophet awaits God's reply. And so in Habakkuk's interaction with God, we see what essentially is an early form of the Socratic method. It's also called the rabbinic method in Jewish studies, in which Habakkuk poses questions of God in order to stimulate his own critical thought processes in a legitimate attempt to gain knowledge and understanding. Habakkuk is not questioning God for the mere sake of questioning God. He's not trying to challenge God or to in any way vilify the supreme creator and sustainer of life. Habakkuk is earnestly seeking understanding. His faith in God never wavers. And in fact, Habakkuk's faith in God is so vigorous and so deep-seated that he is able to express his doubts and his frustrations and then find satisfaction as God answers with new appeals to faith. We've already observed that the primary purpose of Habakkuk was the emphasis on God's holiness, and this really permeates our author's thoughts. Habakkuk is especially concerned for the holiness of God with respect to wickedness in Israel, and in particular the greater wickedness that he sees in Babylon. Habakkuk is distraught over God allowing sin to go unpunished in Judah, but he's perhaps even more appalled at the idea that God would use an even more wicked Babylon as his instrument of divine judgment. And so does this then mean that God approves of Babylon despite their wickedness? This is what Habakkuk is questioning is why does God allow Babylon's wickedness to go unchecked and even use them for his purposes. And so in the end, what we see is that God is patient with sinful men, with mankind, as demonstrated by his delaying in judging Judah. And when he judges, we often see that he even chooses at times to use what Paul described as vessels of wrath in order to accomplish his purposes. But this doesn't mean that God has in any way compromised his own holiness, as Habakkuk was worried that he had or would. Instead, God often simply just allows sin to run its own course, and even to destroy the sinful individual, the sinful nation, in the outworking of God's divine plan. And in this, God is demonstrating his sovereignty, as well as the grandeur of his holiness and his justice. So Habakkuk is tremendously concerned with God's holiness, but God is still holy despite his long suffering in relation to Judah's sins, despite his using an unholy nation to judge Judah. God's holiness is still intact. It's never compromised, if you will. One of the most interesting things about the book of Habakkuk is, in fact, its third chapter. And this chapter really intrigues me. And it's so intriguing that in the studies of Habakkuk, numerous scholars have focused their efforts on determining the origins of Habakkuk 3. Habakkuk 3 is, by tradition, held to be part of the original composition of the book of Habakkuk. The Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, contains Habakkuk 3. So we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that Habakkuk 3 was included with the rest of Habakkuk for the early New Testament church, and even for mainline Judaism as early as 3rd century BC. So at least by 3rd century BC, probably, depending on how you date the Septuagint. 3rd century, 2nd century at the very latest BC. Habakkuk is a part of mainline Judaism. Habakkuk 3 is a part of the text in mainline Judaism. Interestingly enough, however, there was a commentary on Habakkuk discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, which does not contain the 3rd chapter of Habakkuk. Why is this the case? We don't know for sure. This doesn't necessarily mean that the 3rd chapter was even suspect at this time. It could have been that scribes at Qumran didn't have an opportunity to complete the commentary. It may well have been that chapter 3 was of such a decidedly different nature that they chose not to include it in the commentary. But it doesn't necessarily mean that chapter 3 is not a part of Habakkuk at this time, or even that it was suspect. We have it in the Septuagint. We don't have it at Qumran. So what does that tell us? Not a whole lot, unfortunately. Apart from the absence of chapter 3 in the Habakkuk commentary at Qumran, there seems to really be no historical evidence of any kind of dispute over Habakkuk 3 in the late centuries BC. Nevertheless, however, modern scholars have really become engaged in what I think to be an interesting dialogue over the origination and nature of the 3rd chapter of Habakkuk. Habakkuk 3, which we, as I mentioned earlier, call the Psalm of Habakkuk because it does really look like a psalm. It has those qualities of a psalm. But it contains a number of parallels with other ancient Near Eastern mythologies, both Canaanite and Babylonian. And if you took the opportunity to read the paper that I posted on intertextuality and the pre-exilic prophets, posted that. I think I posted that with the Nahum stuff. So week 7 or whatever. Then you've probably already come across some of these parallels. And I think they're intriguing for a number of reasons. And we're just going to spend our last little bit of time here talking about Habakkuk 3, because I really think that there's some good things in here, and I think there's some things that we can take away from this as well. One of the first comparisons that was made between Habakkuk 3 and ancient Near Eastern literature is the connection to the Babylonian dragon myth. In fact, we see in the apocryphal Daniel the story of Bel and the dragon, in which Habakkuk really plays an important role in the episode of Daniel in the lion's den. Habakkuk is brought by an angel to feed Daniel while he's in the lion's den. And so Habakkuk really plays this important role. Now, the connection between Habakkuk and the Babylonian dragon myth is not just derived from the imagery that we have in Habakkuk 3, but also from a perceived textual corruption in Habakkuk 3, verse 13b, the last part of verse 13, in which the phrase, "you smote the head of the house of the wicked," represents a corruption of the original. And the original has been proposed to read something like, "You smote the head of the behemoth, the wicked behemoth." At this point, I want to just take the time and remind you all that particularly when we're dealing with proposed textual corruptions, that a lot of this, and particularly the stuff with Habakkuk 3, is simple conjecture on the part of critical scholars. We have no reason, first of all, to believe that the text was actually corrupted. It certainly makes for an interesting reading and draws on some pretty significant parallels between Habakkuk 3 and the Babylonian dragon myth if the text was corrupted. But we don't necessarily have any legitimate reason to think that it had to have been corrupted. On another side note, when I talk about textual corruption, I certainly am not arguing against the inspired nature of the text. So I don't want you to think that I'm some liberal guy who doesn't believe in the inspiration of Scripture. But we also know that the text was transmitted and copied over numerous centuries by fallible human beings who very easily could have missed a letter here or there. And quite frankly, the earliest copies that we have of Old Testament text may be as many as 1,000 years removed from their original recording. And so it's highly likely that over the course of a millennium or even half a millennium, some variation in the text might have occurred. But as any textual critic worth his salt will tell you, the overwhelming majority of these variations are so extremely minor that they make little to no difference to the text and to its message. And to be honest, whether Habakkuk is constructing something entirely new in chapter 3 or drawing on an ancient Near Eastern myth, it doesn't change the message of Habakkuk 3, which is that God is holy and powerful. And we're going to see a little bit later on how, in fact, drawing on these ancient Near Eastern myths would have even made his argument all the more real for the culture around him. So I just want you to keep that in mind. So we have this Babylonian dragon myth as one of the proposals. On the other hand, we have a number of scholars that see a connection between Habakkuk 3 and the Babylonian creation epic. The imagery of this storm god and then the enemy from the deep that's pictured in Habakkuk 3 really seems to parallel the imagery of the Babylonian creation epic, in which we have Marduk, who is the chief Babylonian deity. He's the storm god, and then Tiamat is the enemy from the deep. Still, we have others who see connections to the Baal cycle in Canaanite mythology. And in Canaanite mythology, Baal is the chief deity, and then Yam is the god of the sea, or the god of the deep. And Baal basically becomes chief among the Canaanite deities because he's battled and defeated Yam, along with a number of other Canaanite gods. Habakkuk 3:5 gives us this interesting personification, if you will, of pestilence and plague. And it notes that pestilence and plague accompany God as tools of his judgment. And these are the Hebrew words davir and resheph, respectively. So we have davir, meaning pestilence, and then resheph, meaning plague. Interestingly, when we look at the Canaanite pantheon, we see two lesser deities by the names of Dabir and Resheph. We even have an ancient text written in Ugaritic that shows Resheph fighting alongside of Baal in his struggle against a dragon. So then what do we do with Habakkuk 3? How do we treat it then? If we have this mythological imagery, if we have evidence of Habakkuk borrowing from mythology, how do we treat Habakkuk 3? I will tell you that everything that I have looked at seems to indicate that quite clearly Habakkuk 3 is employing imagery from some other ancient Near Eastern mythology or mythologies. It could be that Habakkuk is intentionally trying to draw on several different mythologies and epics from multiple cultures. And so what does that mean for us as Christians? How should we read Habakkuk 3? Should we read Habakkuk 3 at all? I think the answer to these questions really lie in how the prophet uses this ancient Near Eastern mythological imagery. And for clarification's sake, I believe that Habakkuk 3 must have been written and attached to the rest of Habakkuk 1 and 2 at the very least soon after Habakkuk 1 and 2 were written. Based on the use of these images in their historical context, I think that we have to say it was probably very shortly after Habakkuk 1 and 2. I don't see any reason to necessitate denying Habakkuk as the author of Habakkuk 3, nor do I see any legitimate reason for placing the writing of Habakkuk 3 at a much later date. So while I can't say that for certain Habakkuk is the author of Habakkuk 3 and it was written at the same time as Habakkuk 1 and 2, I don't necessarily see anything that necessitates that we deny that. So that's my my compromise. That's my not taking a firm stand on that issue. But when we look at Habakkuk 3 in terms of how the prophet used these images, we see something that's actually quite similar to what we saw in Nahum. The prophet is taking these ancient Near Eastern mythologies and motifs and reappropriating them for Yahweh, for the God of Israel. It's not the Babylonian god Marduk, nor the Canaanite god Baal that are responsible for providing order to the world. It's not Marduk or Baal that are the active agents in creation or even destruction. Instead, it is the one true God. It is Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is the one that has ordained all things that come to pass. He's the one that brought order to creation. He's the one that passes judgment upon wickedness. It is Yahweh that is in control. Davir, pestilence, and Resheph, plague, are not deities in the consort of Baal. Instead, Habakkuk presents pestilence and plague anthropomorphically. We try to say that 10 times fast. Meaning, essentially, he's assigning human-like qualities and characteristics to these non-human phenomena. So, far from being gods themselves, pestilence and plague are instead anthropomorphic entities that are serving the purposes of Yahweh. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when I introduced this idea of intertextual usage of other ancient Near Eastern myths and motifs, I don't think this is something that we should be afraid of admitting. And this is where I want to just camp out really for the rest of this lecture. Like Peter and Paul in the New Testament, our Old Testament authors are engaging the culture around them. And we've already seen how prevalent spiritual infidelity was in Israel and Judah during the time of the minor prophets, particularly the worship of the Canaanite god Baal. Hosea really dealt with this, and this time I do mean Hosea. Hosea really taught a lot about spiritual infidelity, and we see that in the picture of his relationship with Gomer. You guys are well acquainted with that at this point, hopefully. So what better way then for Habakkuk to interact with and respond to the culture around him than by beginning with these ancient Near Eastern mythologies and to pointing out that neither Baal nor Marduk nor any other false god is responsible for the order of the world, but rather by using these ancient Near Eastern myths, pointing to Yahweh as God alone and Yahweh as the one that is responsible for creation and order, as well as for justice and judgment. And I think it's important that we realize when approaching a text like Habakkuk 3, particularly from the perspective of his borrowing from ancient Near Eastern mythology and motifs, that allowing for God's prophet to use such imagery and to reappropriate these ancient Near Eastern myths and motifs for Yahweh doesn't denigrate the one true God any more than his use of Assyria and Babylon as instruments of divine judgment denigrates his holiness. The purposes and plans of God remain intact and unchanged regardless of human fallacy and failure. And so God can and will use essentially whatever methods he so desires to bring about his plans and his purposes. And so if that means using wicked nations as instruments of judgment for Judah and Israel, then God will do it. And if that means using polytheistic mythologies to demonstrate the omnipotence and omnipresence of God, then he certainly can and will do that as well. Much of our fear in reading biblical literature in light of its ancient Near Eastern counterparts comes from our desire to disconnect these mythologies from the truth about the one true God. This may in fact be in part a reaction to having our own beliefs criticized and compared to these other myths by individuals outside of our system of beliefs. But I think that what we need to recognize is that all of these ancient myths were in fact an attempt to understand the nature of the created world. They're an attempt to understand how and why the world was created and ordered the way it was. And so for our biblical authors to then come along and to reappropriate these myths for the God, for Yahweh, was not and should not be taboo. Instead, we can understand them as correcting misinterpretations. Habakkuk is taking these myths, these genuine attempts to explain the order of creation on the part of people groups that did not know Yahweh, and then transforming those for his culture. Habakkuk is transforming those myths for Judah, for 7th century Judah in particular, for Yahweh's chosen people, to demonstrate the fallacy and the inadequacy of these myths. They're not inherently evil in their attempts to explain the way the world worked and the nature of the relationship between the creator or creators in some of these myths and creation. They're just wrong. They're just ill-informed. And so Habakkuk and prophets like him come along and they show Judah and Israel that these myths, though they use different names for their deities, they're all, in essence, pointing to the work of the same God, pointing to the work of Yahweh. And so I don't think that we ought to run from interpretations like that. In fact, I think we ought to embrace interpretations like this. We ought to recognize that it's a good thing what Habakkuk was doing in using these ancient Near Eastern myths. He's engaging the culture around him with the cultural stories that point Judah back to the one true God. And so I think it's important for us to recognize this. I think it's important for us to see that certainly Habakkuk was not only well within his divine limitations, but well within his rights to use these ancient Near Eastern myths and to say, look, they call it Marduk, they call it Baal, but in fact, the God that these myths are pointing to is Yahweh God. He is the one true God, the God of Israel. And so that's what I think is so cool about seeing these ancient Near Eastern myths and motifs in the biblical literature, is that these are all motifs and myths that are, in essence, trying to point to the divine. They just don't have the full understanding of who or what the divine is. They don't fully understand Yahweh. And so the prophets come along and they say, here is how these things are pointing to Yahweh. Here is how these myths are, in essence, leading us to see the work of Yahweh God. So I think that's fun. I hope that you guys will enjoy that type of interpretation as much as I have, and not be scared off by it, not run from it or say, "Ooh, that dirty liberal professor that we've got." I really, I really am not. I think it's okay for us to see Habakkuk's use of ancient Near Eastern myth, particularly here in chapter 3. So if you guys have any other questions, concerns, I encourage you, if you haven't read the paper that I gave you on intertextuality in the prophets, I would encourage you to read it. Yes, it's mine, and so I'm naturally biased to think that it's good stuff. But I think that it might kind of enlighten you in a little bit, and in a little, in a way. And please, in reading it, bear in mind that I am a conservative. I am a biblical conservative. I believe the Bible. I'm a conservative. I'm not some liberal joker spouting off heresy. But I think that it's okay for us to see the use of other extra biblical material in the Bible, because I think God can do that if He wanted to. Certainly He could. So, like I said, any questions, concerns, comments, if you want to call me a dirty liberal, just send me an email. Enjoyed it. I hope you guys do too. Have a good week. Shalom.